Hi everyone, my name is Kyle Knapp, and I'm the lead software developer for the AWS CLI. For this session, I'm going to be covering how to upgrade to the AWS CLI V2, which is the latest major version of the AWS CLI, and walk through some of the V2 only features that will boost your productivity from the command line. And first, let's start with an overview of the AWS CLI for those who are unfamiliar with it. The AWS command line interface is a unified tool that allows you to interact with the various AWS services and manage your AWS resources all from the command line. And here's a sample AWS CLI command. This command is just describing a particular Amazon DynamoDB table. And most AWS CLI commands can be broken down into three parts. There's the service command, representing which AWS service to use. The operation commands generally map one-to-one with the services API. So in this example, the describe table command maps directly to DynamoDB's describe table API. And the parameters. Similarly to the operation command, the CLI parameters generally map one-to-one to the API's parameters. So now let's talk about AWS CLI V2. Made generally available earlier this year, it is the latest major version of the AWS CLI. And even though we bumped its major version, the AWS CLI V2 consists of only small breaking changes and generally behaves the same as the AWS CLI V1. But on top of the small breaking changes, we've also introduced some exciting new features to V2 that are going to make you even more productive using the AWS CLI. And in terms of the outline for this talk, I'm first going to briefly discuss how to install the AWS CLI V2 and migrate from V1 to V2. Then, for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to walk through key V2 only features that are going to boost your productivity. So now let's talk about how to upgrade to the AWS CLI V2. So with regards to installing V2, here is its different installation mechanisms along with the platforms that are supported. The AWS CLI V2 is pre-built, so these artifacts are platform specific. So for Linux, you'll want to use the executable installer. For Macs, you'll need to use the PKG. And for Windows, the MSI installer. There's also a Docker image. Its base image is Amazon Linux 2, but the image is runnable on all three of these platforms, assuming you have Docker installed on your system. And it can run Linux-based images. Then, with regards to the backwards incompatible changes made, here's a list of some of the most notable ones. And one thing you may notice is that most of these changes are minor, meaning you don't have to go rewrite entire scripts in order to migrate to V2. Furthermore, for most of these backwards incompatible changes, there's a configuration option to revert back to the V1 behavior. Finally, at the bottom, I have a link to the migration guide. I suggest visiting that page for more information on all of the backwards incompatible changes. Alright, so now let's get to the fun part of this talk and go over the new V2 only features that you have access to, starting with Cli Wizards. Similarly to AWS Console Wizards, Cli Wizards provide a UI that helps guide you through managing your AWS resources. More specifically, they abstract over the AWS APIs, so you do not have to be familiar with a particular service API to accomplish some task with AWS. And here's a sample Cli Wizard command. If you run this command, it'll open a command line wizard for creating a new DynamoDB table. And for most Cli Wizard commands, they're composed of two parts. There's a wizard subcommand, which is the parent command for all wizards related to that particular service, and the actual name of the wizard that you want to run. So let's now move on to a demo to better illustrate how wizards work. And to start, let's talk about a sample application that I'll use for the rest of the session to help motivate the features I'm going to cover. So in this sample application, I'm using AWS Code Build, which is a continuous CI service that allows you to run builds without provisioning, managing, and scaling your own build servers. The primary interface to AWS Code Build is a build specification where you define shell commands to run for your build. And while AWS Code Build is most commonly used for compiling source code, running tests, or publishing packages, Code Build allows you to essentially run any set of shell commands in a serverless setting. So for this sample application, let's say I'm on a team that uses Code Build to run a job that emails the team a list of all issues open in the past 24 hours for our product. So to kick off a build, we can use the Code Build start build command. And after executing the command, we can wait a few minutes for the build to complete. Then we can go to our email client via the browser, and we can see that we have a new email. And in the email, we can see it's related to the issues opened in the past day. we can see the email is sent to support, which is just a shared team alias that I belong to in this demo. And we can see the content of the email is a list of 3 issues that include their title and URL. And hopping into an architecture diagram of this, let's build on this application. Right now we're using Aws CLI to kick off a code build project to send the email. But let's now automate this so it gets triggered on a daily cadence, essentially turning this into a serverless cron job. To do this, we'll use Amazon EventBridge, which is a serverless event bus that allows us to set up a rule that runs daily. And as part of this rule, we will have it assume an IAM role and trigger a build of our code build project. So going back to the terminal now, let's use Cli Wizards to help us set up both the IAM role and the EventBridge rule required for this setup. Starting with the IAM role, we're going to enter its wizard through the IAM wizard new role command. And when I run this command, it enters a form-based UI similar to the AWS console to help us create our role. And to start, I'll be prompted first on who to give permissions to assume this role. So in the wizard, we can choose between a particular AWS service or another account. And I can use the directional keys on the keyboard to scroll down and back up in the selection menu. For our use case, we're going to select AWS service because EventBridge is going to be assuming this role. And to do that, I'll just press enter. And a new prompt will appear asking me to select a service. So I can then scroll down and select EventBridge. And that will move us on to the next prompt where we can select a manage policy to determine the permissions for this role. In the select menu, we can scroll through it, and if we want to see the particular document for a particular one, we can press the right arrow. And you can see this policy allows us to view details about billing. But for this role, we need permissions to start a code build project. So we can use the left arrow to go back to the select menu and scroll through to find an appropriate policy. We then find this start code build policy and use the right arrow to see more details on it. We see that this policy was created specifically for starting a build for our email report project. So we're going to go ahead and select it. Next, we need to give the role a name. And a description. The next prompt will ask us if we want to create a new CLI profile for this. Since we will not be assuming this role locally with the CLI, I'm going to select no. Then finally, before executing the wizard, we can then preview how the resources are going to be set up in the form of either CLI commands or a CloudFormation template. So if we select AWS CLI commands, we can see the planned execution steps translated to CLI commands. So for this wizard, it can be translated to first running an IAM create role command, and then followed up by an IAM attach role policy command. And furthermore, we can tab backwards in the UI and change a value to see how that affects the preview. So if we change the AWS service back up the top to AWS Lambda, you can now see how it updates our policy document to use Lambda in the create role command. We can then go back and change it back to EventBridge. Then to move on, we can hit enter through the prompts to go back to the preview prompt and toggle it to CloudFormation to see how the planned execution steps would look translated to a template. And this preview mode is generally useful for a couple reasons. First, if you're new to the CLI or API for that service, you can use the wizard as a tool to become more familiar. Two, you can use the preview to help automate. So for example, you can take the CLI commands and incorporate them into a script to spin up resources. Or if you manage your infrastructure with CloudFormation, you can merge the resources from the wizard preview with your pre-existing template. So now let's go ahead and create our role by hitting enter to execute the wizard. And with that role created, let's create the EventBridge rule that will assume this new role to trigger our builds. To do this, we'll enter the events new rule wizard. In this wizard, we can start off by giving the rule a name and a description. Next, we need to select a pattern for triggering the rule. Here we are going to select the schedule. Then we can provide the rule with a rate or cron expression. So if we already had a cron expression in mind, we can input one that, for example, triggers once every day at midnight. But for the sake of showing this rule in action, let's tab back and then use the fixed rate option instead to input a smaller cadence. And here we can use a prompt to set the rate to once every minute. In the next series of prompts, we can then select the rule's target, which dictates what it triggers, and select code build. It'll then prompt us to choose a code build project to target, and we can select our email report one. Then we need to provide the role to use to trigger the builds. So we can then select the cron email report role we created in the previous wizard, and select CLI commands as a preview format. Looking at the translation, you can see there are two CLI commands involved. The event put rule command, which creates our rule, followed by the events put targets command that makes it so the rule triggers our code build project. And if we execute the wizard, then wait several minutes to get a couple runs of a rule, we can then go back to the browser to see we got a couple of issue report emails and confirm that they are 1 minute apart each, thus following the rule we created. And to wrap this all up, we can then set the rule back to once a day, which is what we originally wanted. And we can do this by building up a put rule command using the preview from the wizard as reference on how to do it. And with that finished, that about wraps up our demo on wizards. And now to recap this discussion on wizards, the demo illustrated how wizards can help you accomplish a particular task with an AWS service without needing familiarity with its API. Furthermore, you can use wizards as a tool to become more familiar with APIs and automate on top of them as well. Then going back to the outline, let's now move on to auto prompt mode. In general, the AWS CLI has a wide surface area. It has over 200 top-level commands, over 6,000 total commands, and over 37,000 parameters. That being said, it can be tedious figuring out correct CLI commands. The purpose of auto prompt mode is to allow you to figure out the commands you need faster and more efficiently via interactive autocomplete. So to better illustrate auto prompt mode, let's hop into a demo. So let's start with a quick walkthrough of auto prompt mode. In order to enter auto prompt mode, we can just type AWS-CLI auto prompt. And that will drop us into UI that will help us build a CLI command. To start, it opens a select menu that allows us to choose a service command. At the bottom of the UI, you'll see a toolbar for additional key presses that modify it. For example, I can hit the F1 key to open a menu showing all the available shortcuts. Then press the F4 key to make the select menu multi-column based. We can also just start typing, and the select menu will match what we're typing. So if I type EC here, it will provide service commands that begin with EC. And then we can select EC2. Afterwards, we can then toggle through the available operation commands for EC2. We can also press the F3 key to show the docs for that operation command. So as we now scroll through the different operations, you can see how the doc panel changes to reflect the selected operation. Then we can press the F2 button to now focus on the doc panel to scroll and search through it. So for example, I can jump to the example section to see sample commands, and then press Q to switch back to the prompt. And in addition to auto-completing commands based on what the command starts with, auto prompt mode also does fuzzy searching, where it searches if a particular sequence of characters exists anywhere in the command. So we can type instance here, and it'll suggest operation commands that have instance in the name. And we can do the same with the word regions in order to complete the describe regions command. After selecting the operation command, we then choose which parameters we want. So for example, we can select the -- region names parameter, and also select through the various region values available. Then, to execute the wizard, we can press enter and see the command describing the US West 2 region. So now picking up with our sample code build application, let's walk through how we can use autoprompt mode to help us introspect the project and interact with it. And to start, I'm going to run this Aws configure set command to set autoprompt mode to the on setting. What this means is that for any command I run, I'll enter autoprompt mode without needing to include the -s CLI autoprompt parameter. So I now can just type AWS and it will enter autoprompt mode. So now within autoprompt mode, let's use it to discover the commands we need in order to learn more about our code build project. So first, let's go ahead and open up the doc panel and type project in order to fuzzy search through the available commands involving projects. Starting with the list projects command, based on the docs, that just lists the names of all the available code build projects. So let's continue scrolling through. And when we get to the batch get projects command, the docs say it'll get information about a set of projects, so let's select that command. From there, we will need to specify the -s names parameter, and autoprompt mode will do Aws resource completions for us. So under the hood, the CLI is using CodeBuild's list projects API to auto-populate the available project names to choose from, providing us with our only code build project email report. Then to make this command more readable, we'll specify the output as YAML and execute the command. So now we can see the output from this command, and looking at the output, you can see this project is using the Aws CLI Docker image. And you will be also able to find the build specification down below. However, the format for the build spec is a little off because the new lines in white space are being nested in the YAML document. So let's build on this command to make the build spec more readable. So this time we're going to enter autoprompt mode from the code build service command. And then we'll press Ctrl-R to search for previous commands we ran while in autoprompt mode. From there, we can then select the command we ran to make it our starting point. Now we can press the F5 key to show the sample output for the command in the lower panel. And when we toggle through the different output formats that are supported, we can see how the command output changes based on the format. We can also add on the -s query parameter that allows us to specify a James path expression to isolate the build spec for our project, and the output panel will update based on the expression we type. So, for example, we can start by typing projects and index the list at position 0 in order to display information about the first project in the list. And we can focus on this output panel using F2 and jump to where the build spec is declared in the output. And based on the sample output, the build spec is nested inside the source field, so we press Q to go back to the prompt and update our James path expression. Then finally notice it's going to still be quoted. To remove the quotes, we need to go back and update the output format to text. And if we run this command, we get a nicely formatted build spec that we can read and work with. And before moving on, remember that I set my auto prompt setting to on, which means I will enter auto prompt mode for any command that I execute. And now I'm going to update my local configuration to only enter auto prompt mode when I execute commands that are incomplete or invalid. To do this, I'm going to run this Aws configure set command to use the on partial setting, which will now stop this behavior where I get auto prompted for complete commands such as this configure set command. But if I type an incomplete command such as AWS, I'll still enter autoprompt mode. And then to reiterate the purpose for complete commands like the batch get projects command above, it'll run normally without me being prompted. In general, this on partial setting is really useful in the case you have scripts or runbooks that you use already complete CLI commands and you don't want to be interrupted by autoprompt mode. So now I'll go ahead and save the build spec to a file so that we can go over it. And looking at the build spec, there are three main parts. First, it builds a query for issues open in the last 24 hours. Then it uses the DDB select command, which scans the DynamoDB issues table using the query that was built. We'll talk more about that command later. And finally, it runs the SES send email command that sends the email with the results of the query. So now let's make an update to the build spec to both check our understanding of it, as well as make a development environment to start testing updates to it. To do that, we'll go ahead and add the word test to the email subject. And to try out the update to the build spec, let's enter auto prompt mode again and use the start build command. In building this command, we get auto completion for the project name. Then we can find the parameter to use for overriding the build spec and auto-complete the file name of the build spec we saved by prefixing its value with file : //. Then finally, let's update the environment variables so the email gets sent to my email address instead of the shared support address. And auto prompt will help us auto-complete the shorthand syntax for that parameter. And after executing the command, we can then wait a few minutes for the build to complete. Then jump back to our email to see the latest email we got has both the updated subject and it is also sent to me instead of the support address that was used before. So with that now complete, that wraps up our demo on auto prompt mode. And to recap this discussion, the demo showed how auto prompt mode can help you discover and construct Aws Cli commands more quickly through a wide variety of auto-completion, inline documentation, and sample output generation. And to use it, just specify the -s CLI auto prompt flag, or you can configure it to be used by default through the on and on partial settings. So now going back to the outline, let's cover the final part around higher level commands. So unlike the typical CLI commands that mirror one-to-one with the service APIs, higher level commands consolidate complex workflows into customized, easy-to-use command interfaces. And with the Aws Cli V2, we've added more higher level commands. So let's go demo a couple of them. And continuing on with our code build application, let's say we want to dive a bit more into this logic and update the build spec so that the email sent only includes bugs that were reported in the past 24 hours. And we're going to use two V2 only higher level commands, the logs tail command and a DDB select command to help us out here. So first, let's start with the logs tail command, which allows us to review the CloudWatch logs from our previous builds. So we can now enter auto prompt mode and select the tail command. The tail command accepts a single positional argument representing the logs group to display the logs from. So we'll select the logs group associated to our email report project and also set the -s format parameter to short in order to make the logs easier to read. Running the command, we can see it printed out all the logs from the last build we triggered. So we can see everything from the pre-build phase to the DynamoDB query we are using to the status result of the build. And the part that we're most interested in is the query used by the DDB select command on our DynamoDB issue table. So instead of sifting through all the logs to piece together the query, let's just display all the logs that have the word filter in it, which represents the DynamoDB query we are using. To do this, we can go back and update the previous command by adding the -s filter parameter in order to display only the logs that have the word filter in it. And with the logs printed out, we have a more narrow view of what our DynamoDB query entails, and we can copy values from the logs in order to run the exact DDB select command locally in order to better understand the query and build on it. Executing this command, we can see that it displays the same 3 issues from the emails we've been sending, plus several additional attributes, and that is because we did not include the -s projection parameter. And while the DDB select command seems simple, it is abstracting over a fair amount of complexity here. To see, we can enable Cli History Mode, which will store local debugging information for all future commands that we run. Then we can rerun the DDB select command to capture its history. And then use the history show command to see what API calls are being made on our behalf when we use the DDB select command. And when we compare the API call to the command we ran down below, we can see a few things. First, the DDB select command is using the DynamoDB scan operation under the hood. It does expression attribute and value substitution on our behalf for the filter expression, so you can see how the original -- filter parameter is translated. It also does the serialization of values to the correct DynamoDB data type, so you don't have to specify an N for each number used. All in all, if not for the DDB select command, we would have to build up all these parameters ourselves into a single DynamoDB scan command. So now that we have a better understanding of how DDB select command works, let's build up a new filter that only displays the bugs open in the past 24 hours. Looking through the list of issues, we can see each issue has the issue state field that has information on its status and labels. So now let's expand on our query using that information. First, let's go ahead and add an AND to the filter to query the nested issue status property and require its value to be equal to the string open. And you can see now there's only 2 issues returned from this query, and they both have the status of open. And to remove the feature request from this list, let's update the query again to only include issues that contain the label bug. And now you can see the command returns the lone bug from our original list of issues. And if we run the history show command again, we can see how the DDB select command properly serialized our entire filter expression and value types on our behalf, which saved us a lot of time and effort in the end. And now to wrap this up, let's take the updated filter expression we built and update our build spec to test it working from the context of our code build project. So first, let's update the filter expression and then update the email subject to make it specific about bugs. And then we can rerun the start build command from before to kick off a build with the updated build spec. Then we can go ahead and use the logs tail command to help track the progress of the build instead of just waiting to receive an email to know if it succeeded. And here we're going to specify the -- since parameter, so they'll only display logs starting from 1 minute ago, and not include logs from any old builds. We can also add the -- follow parameter to constantly poll for new logs. And after polling for a few minutes for logs from the build, we can see the logs and see that the build succeeded. So if we move back to our email client, it'll have the email with our new bug report, where the subject of the email has been updated, and the issue list will consist only of that one bug from the query. So that wraps up our demo on higher level commands and showed how it helps us out in building on our application. And in addition to the helpful commands I demoed, here's some other V2 only commands I recommend learning about. So along with the DDB select command, there's a put command that abstracts over writes to a DynamoDB table. There are also AWS single sign-on specific commands that allow you to sign in with your username and password to your SSO portal and federate credentials to the AWS CLI. And with the final section complete, let's wrap up this session. So to recap this session, I first went over how to install the AWS CLI V2. I then covered some of the key V2 only features, starting with wizard commands that help walk you through creating and managing your AWS resources. I then covered CLI auto prompt mode, which helps you discover and construct CLI commands using interactive auto completion. And last, I demoed higher level commands. And those were only just some of the new features we've added to CLI V2. On top of those, we've added more configuration commands and options to help you configure the AWS CLI. We've also made some improvements related to command I/O by supporting YAML as both input and output, faster tab completion, and redirection of command output to a pager. I also wanted to share a few links that I recommend checking out after this session. To learn more about all of these features that I discussed, I recommend visiting the AWS CLI user guide. The second link is the link to the migration guide again. Then the final link is to the GitHub repository. So if you have any feature requests or feedback, I recommend opening an issue there. And with that being said, I want to thank you all for listening to my session and hope it got you excited to start using the AWS CLI V2.